90% silver prices. Junk silver prices. Perfect time to stack more now. Somewhere, right now, a decision is being made. A decision that will separate two kinds of people. One group will look at this moment and walk away. The other group will look at the exact same moment and quietly begin building something the first group will never understand. Because what's happening in the silver market right now is not random. It is not noise. It is a signal. And signals like this do not wait for permission. They do not announce themselves twice. By the time most people realize what just happened, the window will already be closed. So the question is not whether this moment matters. The question is, which group will you be in? Welcome to Currency Insight. If this is your first time here, settle in, because we don't do hype and we don't do panic. We deal in patterns, in history, and in the quiet decisions that separate those who prosper from those who simply react. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you for something, not a favor, a small commitment. You know how, back in the day, a handshake meant something? A man's word was his bond, and when someone you trusted told you, pay attention to this, you didn't need convincing twice. Consider this channel that handshake. If you've been with us before, you already know the value of staying ahead of the curve instead of behind it. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button and let that bell notification stay on so the next warning reaches you the moment it matters, not after it's too late. And before we begin, I'd like to know who's actually watching tonight. Type into the comments below. Where are you joining us from? Are you watching from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Canada, Australia, or somewhere entirely different? Let us know your city, your country. Let this community see just how far this warning is traveling. Now, let's get into it. In the early months of 2026, a quiet shift began taking place across the global silver market, one that most people, even seasoned investors, failed to notice in time. For decades, silver had lived in the shadow of gold. It was seen as the smaller cousin, the metal people bought when they couldn't afford gold, or the one collectors kept in coffee cans and shoe boxes without thinking too much about it. Junk silver, old worn coins with no collector value, only melt value, was considered the most boring corner of the entire precious metals world. Nobody got excited about a bag of beat-up dimes and quarters. But somewhere along the way, that boring corner of the market became one of the most important places to watch. It started with a simple observation that very few analysts were willing to say out loud. Industrial demand for silver had quietly overtaken what mining companies could supply. Solar panels needed it. Electric vehicles needed it. The expanding world of electronics and computing power needed it. And while everyone was busy talking about gold reaching new highs, silver was being pulled out of the ground and consumed faster than it was being replaced. This is where the story becomes interesting. A small but growing group of independent stackers, ordinary people, not hedge fund managers, had been buying junk silver for years without much attention. They weren't doing it because they were experts in monetary policy. They were doing it because something felt wrong about the financial system, and silver felt like a piece of solid ground in a world that kept shifting beneath their feet. For years, these people were mocked. Friends called them paranoid. Family members rolled their eyes when a birthday gift came wrapped in an old coin instead of cash. Online, people laughed at the idea that a handful of pre-1965 dimes could ever matter in a modern economy run by computers, algorithms, and digital currency. And yet, those same dimes were quietly disappearing from circulation. Coin shops across small towns began noticing something strange. Customers who used to sell their old silver coins for quick cash had stopped showing up. The shelves that once had steady inventory started running thin. Dealers who relied on a regular flow of silver coming in and out of their stores began raising buy prices just to attract enough supply to stay in business. At the same time, a separate trend was building in the background. One most people were not connecting to silver at all. Massive new data centers were being built across the country, all in service of artificial intelligence. These facilities required enormous amounts of electricity, water, and most importantly, raw materials like copper and silver for wiring, conductivity, and computer components. Tech companies were not interested in old coins, of course. They needed industrial-grade silver, refined and ready for circuit boards and solar cells. But that demand still pulled from the same global pool of silver that junk silver stackers had been quietly drawing from for years. Two completely different groups of buyers, one wearing suits in corporate boardrooms, the other wearing work boots at small-town coin shops, were now competing, without even realizing it, for the same shrinking resource. This is the part of the story most people miss. They assume markets move because of big announcements, dramatic headlines, or sudden crashes. But real shifts often begin quietly, in places nobody is watching. They begin in coin shops with thinning shelves. They begin in mining reports buried on page 12 of financial newsletters. They begin in conversations between people who were laughed at for years, until suddenly they weren't being laughed at anymore. By the time silver prices made it into mainstream financial news, the early movers, the so-called paranoid ones, had already been quietly accumulating for years. They had already built a foundation. They were not scrambling to catch up. They were simply continuing to do what they had always done, while a new wave of buyers, suddenly aware of the situation, rushed in behind them. This is where the real warning begins. Because what happened next would expose a pattern seen again and again throughout economic history, a pattern where the people who pay attention early are rewarded, and the people who wait for confirmation are left scrambling for whatever is left. And in the next part of this story, the numbers behind this shift will reveal exactly how far this gap had already grown, and how little time remained before that gap became permanent. You said, with part 2, start more unique, 800 words. To understand how far this gap had already grown, it helps to look at the numbers. Not the headlines, but the actual figures that most people scroll past without thinking twice. A year earlier, silver had been trading at levels that seemed unremarkable to the average person. It moved up a little, down a little, the way it always had. But over the following 12 months, the metal climbed nearly 80%. Gold, by comparison, rose at a slower pace. For the first time in a long stretch of modern market history, silver was outperforming gold. Not by a small margin, but by a wide and growing one. This detail matters more than it appears to at first glance. Throughout history, when silver begins to outpace gold, it has often signaled something deeper happening underneath the surface of the economy. Gold tends to move when fear enters the system, when people worry about currencies losing value or governments printing too much money. Silver moves for those same reasons, but it also moves for an entirely different reason: physical scarcity. When industrial buyers and everyday savers begin pulling from the same limited supply at the same time, the result is not a slow climb. It is a squeeze. And a squeeze was exactly what was forming. Across small coin shops, dealers who once competed with each other to offer the lowest buyback prices were now competing to secure enough inventory just to keep their doors open. A coin that once carried a small premium above its melt value began carrying a larger one. Buyers who showed up expecting yesterday's prices were quietly told that today's prices were different, sometimes significantly different. Meanwhile, those same data centers mentioned earlier were multiplying at a pace few outside the technology industry fully grasped. Reports began circulating that a single large data center could require electricity equivalent to powering tens of thousands of homes. To meet that demand, more wiring, more conductive materials, and more silver were required at every stage of construction. These were not small orders. They were industrial-scale purchases, made by companies with virtually unlimited financial resources compared to a retail buyer holding a handful of coins. This created an uncomfortable truth that very few people wanted to say plainly. The ordinary stacker buying a roll of dimes at a local coin shop was now, in a very real sense, competing against some of the largest and wealthiest corporations in the world for the same finite resource. It would be easy to assume the small buyer had no chance in that kind of competition. And in some ways, that assumption is correct. A retail stacker cannot outpurchase a multinational corporation, but that was never really the contest. The real advantage belonged to whoever started first, not whoever had the most money. This is where time, not capital, became the deciding factor. Those who had been quietly accumulating silver for years, often one roll or one coin at a time, had already secured their position before the larger competition fully entered the field. They were not trying to outbid a corporation in a single transaction. They had simply spent years collecting small amounts consistently, while almost nobody else was paying attention. By the time the broader market woke up to what was happening, their position was already built. This pattern is not new. It is repeated throughout economic history in different forms. Early investors in emerging industries, early buyers of undervalued land, early holders of currencies before major shifts. The detail that connects all of these moments is the same. The advantage rarely goes to the person with the most resources. It goes to the person who recognized the shift before it became obvious to everyone else. And there's a second detail in this story that deserves attention, one tied directly to behavior, not numbers. When prices eventually dipped even slightly, a wave of panic spread through certain corners of the market. Some sellers, fearing further declines, gave up their holdings at prices far below what they would soon be worth. They were reacting to short-term movement, not long-term structure. Meanwhile, those who understood the underlying supply situation treated the dip not as a warning sign, but as an opportunity quietly being placed in front of them. This divide between those reacting to price and those understanding supply would soon become one of the most important divides in the entire story. Because what happens next is not just about silver climbing in value. It is about what happens to an economy and to ordinary people when a resource everyone assumed would always be available simply isn't anymore. And that consequence reaches far beyond coin shops and stacking communities. What happens to an economy when a resource everyone assumed would always be available simply isn't anymore? That question reaches far beyond coin shops and far beyond the small community of stackers who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. To understand the full weight of this shift, it helps to step back and look at how economies actually behave when a critical material becomes scarce. History offers several examples, and none of them are gentle. When oil supplies tightened in past decades, the effects were not limited to gas stations. Entire industries built around cheap, abundant fuel were forced to restructure overnight. Transportation costs rose. Manufacturing costs rose. The price of nearly everything connected to that one resource rose along with it. The shortage did not stay contained to a single sector. It spread. Silver was beginning to follow a similar path, except this time, the resource sat at the intersection of two enormous demands rather than one. On one side stood the technology sector, racing to build artificial intelligence infrastructure faster than any industrial build-out in recent memory. On the other side stood a quieter, slower-moving demand from everyday people who no longer fully trusted paper currency to hold its value over time. These two forces were not working together. They were not even aware of each other in any meaningful sense, but they were both drawing from the same limited pool, and that pool was not refilling at the pace either side needed. This is where a second consequence began to surface. One tied not to silver itself, but to the people building the very technology that depended on it. Communities near large data center construction projects had started raising concerns. Electricity demands from these facilities were straining local power grids, sometimes to the point where residential areas experienced power instability during peak summer months. Water usage, required to cool the massive server systems inside these centers, drew heavily from local water tables, raising questions in farming communities about long-term water availability. These were not abstract concerns voiced by distant analysts. They were concerns raised by everyday residents standing up in town hall meetings, asking direct questions that often went unanswered. Why was this being built so quickly? Who was actually benefiting from it? And why did approval seem to move faster than the public conversation about it? This tension reveals something important about the silver story as a whole. The materials being consumed by this technological build-out were not limitless. The public was beginning to notice that the costs of this expansion, in resources, in electricity and water, and now in the price of silver itself, were being absorbed by ordinary communities while the benefits concentrated elsewhere. Meanwhile, those who had recognized the resource squeeze early were not reacting with panic or protest. They had already adjusted their position years earlier, simply by choosing to hold a tangible asset, instead of relying entirely on currency that could be created in unlimited quantities by decision-makers far removed from their daily lives. This is the quiet lesson sitting underneath the entire situation. It was never really about coins or stacking or even silver itself. It was about understanding, ahead of time, how systems behave when demand quietly outpaces supply for long enough. Those who understood this principle early did not need to predict every detail correctly. They simply needed to recognize the direction things were moving and position themselves accordingly, long before the broader public caught on. By this point in the story, two distinct groups had fully formed. One group was still reacting to headlines, news segments, and short-term price swings, often a step behind the moment that mattered most. The other group had stopped reacting altogether. They were simply watching the structure beneath the surface, aware that the real story was unfolding slower and more quietly than most people realized. And, as the final piece of this story comes into focus, the gap between these two groups would become impossible to ignore, revealing exactly what was at stake for those who acted and those who waited too long. The gap between these two groups did not close. It widened slowly at first, then in ways that became difficult to ignore. For those who had spent years quietly accumulating silver, the situation had reached a point of quiet confirmation rather than surprise. They were not celebrating. They were not making bold predictions on social media or claiming victory over anyone who had doubted them. They simply continued doing what they had always done, adding small amounts when they could, holding what they already owned, and treating short-term price swings as background noise rather than reason to change course. For the second group, the experience looked very different. Some had waited on the sidelines for years, telling themselves they would buy once prices became more attractive, once the market settled, once they felt more certain. But certainty rarely arrives at a convenient time. By the time silver's rise became impossible to ignore, the entry point they had been waiting for no longer existed. They were left choosing between paying significantly more than early buyers had paid, or continuing to wait, hoping for a deeper pullback that may or may not come. Others had owned silver at one point, only to sell during a moment of fear, convinced that falling prices signaled further decline. For some of them, that decision meant walking away from an asset before its value fully matured, often to cover short-term needs that felt urgent at the time. Whether that trade-off was worth it depended entirely on their circumstances. But it illustrated clearly how reacting to short-term price movement can shape long-term outcomes in ways that are difficult to reverse. This divide extended beyond individual buyers and into entire communities. Towns near data center developments continued to grapple with strained power grids, water concerns, and questions about whether the promised economic benefits matched the resources being consumed. Coin shops in small towns adjusted to a new normal, where steady silver inventory was no longer guaranteed, and customers learned to expect different prices than what they remembered from years before. Meanwhile, the broader economic pattern underneath this story remained unchanged. Two forces, industrial demand tied to rapidly advancing technology, and quiet, individual demand tied to a loss of confidence in paper currency, continued drawing from the same limited resource. Neither force showed signs of slowing. If anything, both appeared to be accelerating, each unaware of or indifferent to the other's presence in the same market. This is the part of the story that deserves the most attention, not because it offers a dramatic conclusion, but because it offers something more useful, a pattern that is repeated throughout economic history, long before silver and likely long after. Resources that appear abundant rarely stay that way once two unrelated forces begin competing for them simultaneously. The early observers, the ones willing to look foolish, willing to be early, willing to act before confirmation arrived, consistently found themselves in a stronger position than those who waited for certainty. This was never a story about predicting an exact price or timing a perfect entry point. It was a story about recognizing structural shifts before they became headlines, and understanding that by the time something becomes common knowledge, the advantage tied to that knowledge has usually already passed to someone else. The silver market of 2026 simply became the latest chapter in that pattern. One more example of a lesson that history keeps offering to anyone willing to pay attention before the rest of the world does.